I want to pay tribute to an extraordinary American. I stand here today to pay my respects to a World War II veteran who dedicated his life to public service. After serving his country in uniform in the Navy, this gentleman from Alabama served the American people as a civil servant. For more than 4 decades, he was a tenacious watchdog chasing down fraud, waste, and abuse at the Pentagon. A hero for taxpayers and a warrior against waste, Ernie Fitzgerald recently passed away at age 92. Today, I would like to sing the unsung praises of this remarkable champion of whistleblowers. He was fiercely independent watchdog. He was one of the rarest of breeds. He brought uncommon devotion to his work. He prevailed against the muzzle of many of his handlers, who he called overdogs. They used to try to get him and silence him. He prevailed over those muzzles. It didn't work, because when Ernie sniffed wrongdoing, he would sink his teeth in and never let go. He was a bulldog. His superiors squirreled him away in a far-flung cubbyhole at the Pentagon. They basically exiled him to the Pentagon attic. The big dogs at the Pentagon didn't want this watchdog's work seeing the light of day. As Americans, we're blessed to have a constitutional protections of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. These beacons of liberty worked to Ernie's advantage. Our system of checks and balances also helped make sure wrongdoing was never swept under the rug. Throughout my public service, I pay close attention when I get a whiff of wrongdoing. I've learned a pervasive stench is often not far behind. As a lifelong Iowa farmer, I know what a load of manure really smells like. So when I ran into a bit of institutional gridlock in my efforts to freeze the defense budget back in the early 80s, I wanted to talk to a pair of analysts at the Pentagon. Their efforts exposed the federal money hose showering unbridled tax dollars over bloated defense contracts. Ernie Fitzgerald and a fellow named Chuck Spinney, of course, aren't household names, but their crusade to fix the fiscal mess at the Department of Defense inspired this senator to conduct robust oversight for the last 4 decades. Ernie's body of work helped me to derail the Pentagon's gravy train. Do you remember back 3 decades ago, and probably examples today, of $450 hammers, $640 toilet seats, and $7,600 coffee pots? Those are real items, and those are real figures. Those price tags for spare parts gave taxpayers sticker shock, and ought to for good reason. Americans know the price of everyday household items. They sure know what a hammer or a toilet seat costs at their local hardware store. As Ernie Fitzgerald explained, Americans aren't expected to know what a B-1 bomber or an F-15 fighter should cost, but when you add that all up, you get a boondoggle of overpriced spare parts flying in close formation. Those are Ernie's words. Ernie's fiscal forensics uncovered mountains of mismatched receipts and invoice gaps that left taxpayers footing the tab for rampant waste and unchecked spending sprees. Ernie Fitzgerald was a sleuth for truth. His quest gave Pentagon officials heartburn. His work gave me the leverage that I needed in Congress to enact an across-the-board spending freeze. But I'm getting a bit ahead of Ernie's story. For the record, Ernest Fitzgerald is a patriot, a whistleblower, and a watchdog. He had a heart of gold, but it was as tough as nails. He outmaneuvered top military brass by getting down to brass tacks. He was a gentleman's gentleman with a big Southern drawl and a bone-deep genetic allegiance to the truth. In fact, his allegiance to the truth was a big bone of contention between him and those on the highest rung of power of the U.S. government. From the President of the United States to the most highly decorated brass in the U.S. military. Ernie had uncommon courage to stand up for the truth at great expense to his career. He put integrity and pride above saving his own hide. He spoke truth to the powers that be, and he lost his job for doing that. As I mentioned, our acquaintance started during my first term in the Senate. I was awfully wet behind the ears. I was a dyed-in-the-wool fiscal conservative. At the same time, I was cutting my teeth as a congressional watchdog. Ernie Fitzgerald, at that time, was on a short leash at the Pentagon. Having been rehired, can you believe this, under court order, after being fired for blowing the whistle on fiscal mismanagement at the Pentagon. That's how whistleblowers were treated then, and they're still treated the same way today. I want to remind my colleagues and the American people where Ernie's earnestness for truth landed him. The 37th President of the United States referred to Ernie Fitzgerald in those infamous Watergate tapes. You know who that was, that's Nixon. He said, and I quote, this is about Ernie Fitzgerald, quoting Nixon, "Get rid of that SOB," end of quote. Those marching orders were delivered after Ernie spilled the beans at a Joint Economic Committee hearing on November the 13th, 1968. He testified before Senator Proxmire's panel that taxpayers were on the hook for a $2 billion cost overrun on the C-5 aircraft. For this transgression of truth-telling, he was fired by the Air Force. Let me be clear. Ernie Fitzgerald lost his job for committing the truth. And that reveals the big-time risks that whistleblowers face even today if they step forward to expose wrongdoing. Thanks to Ernie's characteristic resilience, sheer determination, and our system of checks and balances, Ernie got his job back. He filed a lawsuit that made its way through the courts. It took a dozen years through the courts to get that job back. But on June the 15th, 1982, Ernie returned to work at the Pentagon, but in the attic of the Pentagon. That's 14 years after he testified about C-5 and its $2 billion cost overrun. Although Ernie held a very senior position in the Air Force with the job title, quote unquote, Management Systems Deputy, the Pentagon, or he at the Pentagon, was kept at arm's length. His job description was spelled out in a court order, but he was never allowed to do that job that the court said he ought to have. That's how whistleblowers are treated. You ignore them. You put them in the attic. They go nuts. He was treated as an outcast, as I'm sure I'm demonstrating to you. He was snubbed by his superiors and left to his own devices to make a difference. Once again, the genius of our system of checks and balances came into play. Ernie was not stubbed by this United States senator. In fact, we discovered we shared a bone-deep genetic aversion to waste. Like many Midwesterners, I don't like to waste time or money. That's why, as a U.S. Senator, I try to keep a tight-fisted grip on the federal purse strings. It is why, as a taxpayer watchdog, I take oversight work very seriously. Every member of Congress has a constitutional duty to conduct oversight. Every member of Congress. We need the eyes and ears of whistleblowers to root out the truth. That's why I want to hear what whistleblowers have to say. As a new senator in a Republican administration, the Reagan administration, I previously mentioned my proposal to enact a yearly across-the-board budget freeze. An across-the-board spending freeze guarantees shared sacrifice. But I wanted to make sure it could be done without harming national security. So I needed answers from people who could tell the truth. I called on the Secretary of Defense, at that time, Weinberger, and asked if I could talk to a Pentagon budget analyst named Chuck Spinney. I was told yes, he could come to my office, but it turns out the Pentagon didn't want Chuck Spinney, a civil servant, briefing me. So at that time, I had an orange Chevette. I jumped in it and drove from the Capitol over to the Pentagon. Even then, Chuck Spinney wasn't allowed to see me. As I watched the Pentagon disappear in my rearview mirror, I thought the Pentagon was making a mistake. So I didn't realize the publicity blunder it would turn out to be. What I did know is that one way or another, this senator was going to be able to talk to that civil servant, Mr. Spinney, that the Pentagon didn't want me to talk to. 6 weeks later, Chuck Spinney testified before a standing room only joint hearing of the Senate Budget and Armed Services Committee. It was held in the ornate Russell Caucus Room. Chuck Spinney exposed the mismanaged fiscal mess at the Department of Defense. The Pentagon was front-loading the budget, effectively stuffing 10 pounds of manure in a 5-pound sack. The following Monday, Chuck Spinney's photo was on the cover of Time magazine. The next time I wanted more answers about ongoing fiscal mismanagement at the Defense Department, I took a second road trip in my orange Chevette to the Pentagon. This time I wanted Mr. Ernie Fitzgerald to testify before my subcommittee. Needless to say, the Pentagon didn't roll out the red carpet for me. But there were about 50 members of the press crammed into Ernie's attic cubbyhole to witness this U.S. senator handing Ernie Fitzgerald a subpoena. Courageous truth-tellers can make all the difference, and Ernie was such a courageous truth-teller. Ernie's evidence showed that contracting waste was bloated defense budgets and not beefing up military readiness. Instead, they were padding contractor profits at taxpayers' expense. Ernie Fitzgerald's pursuit for truth is one of the primary reasons that I also work to strengthen whistleblower protections. What I like to call committing the truth often comes with a steep price. Whistleblowers like Ernie Fitzgerald put their jobs, their livelihoods, and their reputations on the line. The pressure in this bureaucracy, in this government, to go along to get along is entrenched in a culture in both the public and private sectors. But of course, it's a way of life in the Pentagon. In the late 1990s, I borrowed Ernie for a couple years to work in my Senate office. He was assigned as an Air Force representative and expert who worked side by side with my staff. Together, we investigated vendor payments and bookkeeping, and particularly in the Defense Finance and Accounting Services. This was their account payable operations. It was a tedious and time-consuming work. But Ernie Fitzgerald's unwavering work ethic was up to that task to restore the public trust. And Ernie Fitzgerald never minced words. He attributed lax procurement rules and, of course, cronyism as the reasons the taxpayers were being fleeced. And he was bound and determined to stop these shenanigans. As Ernie once said, and I want to quote him, "Government officials, from the majestic office of the president to the lowest, sleaziest procurement office, lie routinely and with impunity in the defense of the system." End of quote. In 1998, Ernie testified at a congressional hearing I conducted to examine 2 audits freshly prepared by what was then called the General Accounting Office. The hearing was called, quote, "License to Steal, Administrative Oversight of Financial Controls at the Department of Defense," end of quote. The audits revealed non-existent internal financial controls. Basically, the Defense Department bookkeeping system was on autopilot. It allowed for freewheeling spending spree. The absence of basic financial controls fostered fraud, outright theft, and mismanagement of tax dollars. It was a story of rinse and repeat. Costly accounting errors were masked by a fundamentally flawed payment system that can't be audited, even today. Working from within this bureaucratic behemoth, Ernie Fitzgerald devoted his life to exposing the abuse of power within the military-industrial complex. Outsized, but now outmatched, Ernie Fitzgerald evokes the image of David versus Goliath. At the height of the Cold War, he helped freeze a galactic defense buildup and shielded taxpayers from massive, unaccountable expenditures. America owes a debt of gratitude to this now deceased Ernie Fitzgerald and to the brave work of whistleblowers who will follow in Ernie Fitzgerald's legendary footsteps. These courageous truth-tellers risk everything to shed light on wrongdoing. Ever since I met Ernie Fitzgerald and came to know the bureaucratic stonewalling that he fought against, I have worked to empower and protect whistleblowers. Transparency brings accountability. Since passage of the bipartisan Grassley-Berman updates of the False Claims Act, way back in 1986. The Abraham Lincoln era anti-fraud tool is credited with recovering nearly $60 billion back into the federal treasury, and they're still counting at the average of about $3 to $4 billion a year. The Department of Justice has called it the government's single most effective anti-fraud weapon that it has in its arsenal. I'm told my amendments effectively deter hundreds of billions of dollars of fraudulent activity. As long as I'm in this Senate, I will continue to work to keep the False Claims Act razor sharp and to strengthen whistleblower protections. I'll always remember the good work of Ernie Fitzgerald and lots of others like him who kept their nose to the grindstone to do simply what is right. Ernie Fitzgerald's long march for the truth teaches us that it requires constant vigilance to weed out a deep-rooted culture of cronyism. From the military-industrial complex to big pharma and elsewhere. As co-founder of the Senate Whistleblower Protection Caucus, I will work to see that the mission of truth tellers is protected for generations to come. I will continue to work to strengthen sunshine laws, whistleblower protections, and enforcement of Inspectors General Act. The Inspector General of the Justice Department called whistleblowers the lifeblood of his organization's work. I completely agree. I will long remember the genteel Southern drawl and the charm of my friend Ernie Fitzgerald. I'm glad I was able to visit him in person at Sunrise Nursing Home at Falls Church, Virginia. He leaves behind a legacy of truth that ought to encourage every American to stand up for what's right and what is just. Like many whistleblowers, Ernie Fitzgerald took the road less traveled. And in the words of Robert Frost, quote, "That has made all the difference," end of quote. In closing, Barbara and I extend our condolences to Ernie's peers, friends, and family members. I bid this faithful public servant a fond farewell with a scripture message that he shared with me from time to time. He understood that when the going got tough, the tough got going. To my departed brother in Christ, may the words of John chapter 8, verse 32 carry him to life everlasting. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. I yield the floor.